Hello, hello, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. For those of you who don't know me, I am Brie Castellini, Seed&Spark's Film Community Manager. We'd first like to acknowledge that we are all on land that is occupied territory, and for myself, I am currently moderating this session from Ute land. So please check the YouTube live comments feed or the video description for a link to a First Nations COVID Relief Fund and an amazing app that will tell you exactly whose land you are currently watching from. And if you're not familiar with Seed&Spark, we are a platform built to support creators by providing tools for wherever you are in your journey, whether that's crowdfunding or education for creative distribution approaches and beyond. So thank you so much for joining us today for the myths of agents and managers. And without further ado, it makes sense that we should invite our Lauren and Jessica, our wonderful guest, to the screen with me so that they can introduce themselves. So we'll have Jessica go first and then Lauren. So in as much detail as you would like to provide, who are you?
My name is Jessica Mendez Siqueiros, and I am a writer-director that started out as a writer-director crowdfunding a film on Seed&Spark 3 years ago, almost exactly.
And it looks like somebody who contributed to your campaign's actually in the audience. Hello to Mel.
Great. Hello. Thank you. You helped start this whole journey. I've directed now 3 shorts with different variations of some sort of support from corporations, and am on this journey a little bit later.
And I'm Lauren Dineley. I am a manager at a company called Writ Large. I am Jessica's manager, and I'm originally from Toronto, and I moved out here to LA 6 years ago to attend grad school and started working at Writ Large shortly thereafter.
What did you attend grad school for?
Producing for film and TV.
Very cool. So it seems very aligned. So yes, I was not involved in the casting of this wonderful panel, but I was involved in the email chain that resulted when we connected you guys for the first time, and it became very evident that you know each other and are in fact working together. So could you tell us a little bit about how the two of you met and started working together?
I must admit, over at Writ Large, we tend to work in teams, and I can't take any credit for finding Jessica's brilliant work, because that would go to my colleague, and Jessica's other manager, Bash Naran. I think it was through the AT&T lab, correct?
Yeah, it was through Gunpowder and Sky. Mm-hmm. It was actually through, because I did at Naleep, I did a speed dating kind of thing, you could say, with a whole bunch of executives, and for a project that Lauren has also put her blood and sweat and tears now into at this point. And at that point, we were pretty much in an even earlier stage than we are now, and it wasn't right for anybody, but luckily had enough support and love for what it could be that I got sent to a few managers and met with Lauren and Bash, and it was pretty obvious that was my team.
Very cool. So is that kind of a common story, Lauren, for Writ Large, is finding folks through fellowships and networking opportunities, or?
Yeah, I think, we come across clients in all sorts of ways. I think any manager sort of worth their salt is always looking for new talent, and wherever they can find it. Certainly fellowships and networking at festivals and those sorts of organizations, competitions. I'd say a lot do come by referral though, as well, from, if Jessica met with an executive there who was then sending her to managers, a lot of that comes our way as well. And also just I don't know, if I find a tweet that I think is really funny, I'll be like, who's this person? Because I think it's always worth exploring sort of every avenue.
That's really interesting. And we'll definitely come back to that. I imagine a lot of our audience will have questions, but obviously the first big question that makes sense to sort of unpack here on this panel is what the difference is between agents and managers. So Lauren, can you kind of speak to sort of the different functions that these two roles have for a creator?
For sure. I always like to say that it's sort of a bit of a Venn diagram, and there is a lot of common ground, which is, advocating for the client, strategy on career. That's sort of the common ground, and seeking opportunities, and then sort of the later stages of creative work. Usually, that's sort of the part that's more management, is the creative development from sort of idea to final draft, and the agents sort of tend to come in towards the latter end of that. It also depends on the agent, of course. Some like to be a little bit more involved, but and then the thing that we can't do that agents do, which is like the negotiation and the deal making element. They're fiduciaries and we're not. And then, the sort of most agencies, or not most, but a lot of agencies are just sort of bigger entities than management companies. So this sort of information gathering and flow of that information that goes through them is sort of beyond the reach of a smaller company.
Sure. And so, Jessica, do you have a manager and an agent? Just managers right now?
Yeah, I have two of both.
Okay.
My agents are at WME in the TV lit department. Yeah, and then I have Lauren and Beth.
So all like literary sort of management and agents.
Yeah. Obviously, Lauren and Bash are like my cheerleaders, and I feel like the biggest difference is the length of the emails.
Yeah.
And a paragraph.
Yeah, I would say the other, and again, it depends on the agent, but I would imagine another, and maybe that's just also me as a human, but I am also like quite close and friendly with a lot of my clients, and there is sort of a, like, I always like to use the word intimacy that I just think is a little bit perhaps like different than with agents, and again, depending on the agent, but I definitely have like a friendship with a lot of mine. And I think that also sort of lends itself to that creative work. If they don't feel comfortable with me, they can't be vulnerable in that development process.
So is that what drew you to becoming a manager, Lauren, post-grad school? Just the intimacy of getting to work with a lot of different really cool creators?
Yeah, there was a lot that drew me to it. I didn't think I wanted to be one. And I sort of fell into working at Writ Large, and within a few months of working at Writ Large for one of the partners here, here being, I'm in my room, but here being a relative term, of course. I think the things that really appeal to me about it is it's incredibly entrepreneurial, sort of get to dictate my own business. I think I come by that honestly. Both my parents own their own businesses. I love, then to your question, like the intimacy and the sort of ability to grow with a client rather than sort of work on singular projects. I really love the long-term nature of it. And then the third thing that is probably most important to me is, by virtue of my position, I'm sort of a gatekeeper, and I don't like that word because it's so exclusionary, but, I try to use that power for good. So I try to represent a bunch of, the overwhelming majority of my list is people whose voices haven't traditionally been heard in Hollywood. And that's a really big focus for me. And I really sort of believe in that mission.
That's awesome. So Jessica, how did you, obviously we know how you met Lauren. How did you meet your agents over at WME? Was it also through Pozole?
No, it was through the AT&T Hello Lab.
Okay.
They were in the for our premiere, and like, it's really interesting that I do think that finding reps is like this weird. It's not the experience that you think it's gonna be. I mean, Lauren and Bash, I would call, like, if I'm having a panic attack, I would definitely like call them and be like, okay, what am I doing with my life? And I do feel that like kinship with them. As far as finding agents, it does feel very like, oh, okay, this is happening, cool. Okay, we're like the same stuff is just gonna kind of keep happening. They're there. If I like when we need a contract worked out or read, or like, it does feel a little surreal and like, oh yeah, that it did happen, and it was kind of this smooth thing. Like, oh yeah, they saw my work and now I'm there.
So can you talk me through like some of the maybe misconceptions you had as a creator going into the representation world? Like what did you expect out of finding a manager and agent, working with a manager and agent, and how is that different from the reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think I went through my disillusionment process when I was an actor.
Got it.
And trying to find reps, and I think that that actors are even more susceptible to the like, once I find reps, my whole life's gonna change thought process. Because I just think the nature of being a writer director is continuously disillusioning. You're like constantly like, oh, I wrote this thing, and then you're like, we're gonna make it really fast, and everything is gonna just like happen in 3 months, and then you realize that 2 years later, you've had a really successful run, but it's like been such a slow process. And I think it's the same. I mean, it's the same exact thing working with a team. Like, I feel like we've had so many wins, but at the same time, I continuously feel like I feel this immense responsibility, especially to Lauren and Bash, because they've done so much for me, that rather than me being like, oh my God, I feel like, what are they doing for me? I feel like when you have a really good management team, I feel continuously responsible. So I'm like, I haven't really made any money yet. Like, at some point, these people gotta get paid. Like, we gotta do something for them. Like, what, you know? And I think that's such a flip that when people are like looking and seeking reps, that you don't realize that like, if you have a good team, it's gonna feel like having a good relationship. That like, you're gonna feel so supported, and you're not gonna feel like you're begging for attention and love.
That's good to hear. And something that you just mentioned that I want to make sure that we make very clear, and Lauren, correct me if I'm wrong, but generally speaking, representation should not be paid until you get paid. Is that true? Is there ever a circumstance where like, okay, there's no other circumstances?
I have heard rumor of people who ask for you to pay them to represent you. Mm-hmm. That is not something I would advise you do.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that up front, is that if somebody is asking for money to represent you, do some more research.
Yeah, typically, you know, in all the sort of legitimate versions of it I've seen, it's, you know, we managers and agents both take 10% in success.
Got it. Very cool.
The only circumstance, I should clarify, the only circumstance in which you maybe want to pay someone is if you hire a lawyer to do a contract for you. If you have a lawyer who represents you, they take 5% in success. But if there are some circumstances where you would hire a lawyer on like an hourly basis to do some contract work or something. If you don't have other representation, then that is legitimate to pay them rather than giving them 5%.
Got it. But that's a lawyer. That's not an agent or a manager. That's somebody you're hiring for a specific
job. But they're sort of
job.
in the bucket of in the bucket of representation, because, you know, many of my clients also have lawyers.
Fair enough. So Lauren, when you have a new client, what is your first step to sort of onboarding them and starting the management process? What happens first?
Sorry, I don't know what that was. The first step of the process is sort of twofold. I think it's getting their work out there. You know, typically when you start working with someone, there's a piece of material that you've sort of responded to and is the reason why you work together. And it's about sort of exposing that piece of material and them as a creator to executives and producers and the people who can, you know, hopefully help them along in their career and get work and sort of start building a network of fans. And then the other part of it is sort of thinking about what's next. So it's sending me, you know, all your ideas or the script you're working on. You know, for Jessica, it was the feature project she mentioned earlier. We were, you know, it was like, okay, well, we've got Pozole, we've got Adeline, great. We can send this out to everyone and their grandmother because they're excellent. And then, you know, what's the thing you're working on next that's going to be, you know, the thing that we're pushing forward in that regard.
Got it. And so, Jessica, you describe yourself as a writer-director, which was actually a little bit of a surprise, just because I've heard from a lot of other people who are recently managed that they were told to sort of pick a lane. Has that been something that you've had to navigate? Have you had to sort of lean into one side over the other, or have you found that like it's totally possible to pursue your career as a multi-hyphenate?
I'm personally a super big fan of like just like following your heart and love 100% and like following your brand and being so specific. I think one of the things that, when I was talking to Writ Large, when I was first meeting with Lauren and Bash, was that there was absolutely a sense of like, well, here's the things that you could, like, here's the things that I've been told in the world, and them really being like, we support the artists, and like you as an artist, or, you can't box in. I don't think boxing in an artist as a means to advertise that artist is like is a life that I personally want to live. And for me, I think that the more specific you can be as a writer director, I think you have to be hyper specific if you want to have that title, because I think the more general you are as an artist, the more people want to box you in order to help market you. But if you're really like thinking about that stuff yourself and processing, okay, what do I want to say in the world? What do I want to say? And how do I want to package it in a way that feels really unique to me and my voice? Then like my hope is that I can make their job easier and do what I actually love and be able to say no to things that don't feel right to me, that feel like, okay, well, if I'm just a writer, then I close off this huge part of myself, and that doesn't feel right.
Yeah, just to sort of add to that, like I can't imagine telling a creative to do one thing. That feels incredibly limiting. And especially, quite frankly, I'm almost surprised to hear that someone's been told to pick a lane, because let's say they pick directing. It is so much harder to be just a director than it is to be a writer-director, because you can't generate your own material.
Sure.
And I think we see that even in the content that's out there and getting made, is most of it is like, most people are writer-directors nowadays. It's very rare that they're just directors, because you just don't have much control until you're in control.
Sure. So when you're sort of navigating, finding work and contracts and stuff, are you billing clients who consider themselves writer-directors as both for every project? Or are there some that you do think that you need to pick a lane to? Or
it depends what the opportunity is, right? If there's a finished script that is looking for just a director, then I might mention that they're capable of writing, and often, if they want somebody to do a pass and then direct it, like, it's about tailoring it to the opportunity rather than sort of only having one way of presenting a client.
Got it.
I've had so many friends that have come to me and been like, this is the kind of horror story moment that I'm having with my management team. And it often feels like when your best friend comes to you and is like, I'm dating this really abusive guy. And you're like, okay, maybe you should break up with them. And then people get into this feeling of like, well, but then I'm going to be alone. Yeah. And it just always sounds like, well, maybe that's better. Like, you can get a really good lawyer. You need to have somebody that believes in you. And if somebody is telling you, like, it's like dating somebody that's like, I love that you're so happy all the time, but I don't like the way you laugh. Can you please laugh a different way? And it's like, no, this is just like a part of me. This is the way I exist. And like, maybe you should find somebody that loves the way you laugh,
Totally. Yeah, I think that's a good metaphor too. Sorry, just to say that I think that some people get caught in those relationships because they're worried that they're not going to have anyone else afterwards. And they're like, well, isn't something better than nothing? And it's like, well, not if something is actively toxic to you and your ability to do the things you want to do in our very short time on this earth. But Lauren, please, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I think Jessica's absolutely right. I have friends who I do not represent who do have representation, and I'm all, oftentimes they'll come to me and they'll be like, this is what they're saying to me, or this is what they're doing. And I'm like, absolutely not. Like, I think you, and you don't want to be represented by someone who doesn't believe in you. It's like just having someone, because they're not going to be doing the job properly. And let alone in terms of like supporting you creatively and in that way, but like in terms of actually doing the job of like getting you work. If they don't believe in you wholeheartedly, what's prompting them to advocate for you and pitch you and bring you up for opportunities? So, let alone the creative side of it.
No, that's a great point. And actually, we have a great question from viewer Stephanie Walker, who asks, what questions would you recommend writers ask when meeting with managers in order to feel out whether or not this would be a good fit?
Should I take that one?
I think you can.
Well, I guess both of us can, but I always think it's such a personality fit. Like, I don't know if there's necessarily a list of questions to be asked. I think it's very much about feeling comfortable and personality. I think a question I always like to be asked is about how I do development and like my sort of method of development, because I think it's very revealing of how I operate in the other realms of my job, and which is I'm very collaborative, and I really like to ask questions. I really like to understand intention when I'm developing, rather than being like, this bumped on me. I'll be like, what's the intention? What did you mean to do here? And I'm like, this is not I always want to know what the end goal is. And there's this sort of beautiful thing in my job, at least, like in so many development jobs, you're sort of developing towards an end goal, whereas I'm developing towards like the best representation of my client, so it's all about intention, rather than about, a finished product that feels quite different, and not necessarily always in line with the intention of the artist. So that's a question I always really like to be asked, and sort of questions about process in other realms and how accessible they're going to be, and whether that aligns with what you need from your manager. I'm pretty open. I'm like, Jessica, you can text me, but some people might feel differently. And I think it's about finding those fits. But all in all, I don't know if it's so much about questions as much as it is about just feeling comfortable and like being able. My colleague Bash, who also, as we mentioned, also represents Jessica, has this saying where he's like, I want my clients to feel like I can invite them to Thanksgiving dinner. And I think that, and I'm sure he said that to you, Jessica. And I think that's such a great way of sort of phrasing it, because it's just a comfort level that allows you to be vulnerable with them.
For me, I because I did meet with, I think, like 3 different management companies, and one of the things that I was really interested in is like, where do they fall in the like old school, new school spectrum of viewing what we do, and how comfortable are they with me saying no? And like, that was a huge thing for me, is like, how comfortable are you that I might say no to a lot of things because I want to do the things that are going to get me the career and the life that I really want and that I love. And that's more important to me. Like, essentially, like, how comfortable are you with me not making you money for a while? It's like, it really was like a tester, and it's a really uncomfortable question, because somebody might be viewing you as like, okay, we're going to go out, we're going to market you, we're going to make some money. Like, it can be very much that kind of place. And so, asking somebody, okay, how much do you believe in me? How long-term do you believe in me? I think is important.
It's so funny. I don't remember you asking that question. And the reason I don't remember is because, of course, you should be allowed to say no. Like, that to me, like, and, that's why we ended up working together. But to me, it's like, of course, like, I want my clients to say no. My clients who say yes too much stress me out in their own in their own way. Because I'm like, no, you should be more sort of, there should be a lot of intention behind the choices you make in your career.
Yeah.
So Jessica, is that what you mean by new school, old school? Old school is hustle, take everything, who knows what'll happen, and new school is, being really intentional? Or is there something else in the dichotomy that you meant? For
me, it was also like, are you kind of going to throw me into the path of like figuring out how to TV direct and having to like going through kind of the motions that are going to set me up for a career where it's like we're banging out stuff in such a form that it feels like I've had such a non-traditional entry into this industry. I started as an actor. I didn't know I was going to be a writer-director, despite my father being like, you're going to be a writer, trust me, like that's where you're going, and me being like, no, 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 no. And then here I am. And so like through that resistance, I've been able to actually do things that I love, versus following kind of a path. I've had so many people tell me like, well, what you're trying to do is so hard. And I'm like, but look at what's kind of happened already. So like you can't, the more likely somebody is to say like, that's not the way things are done. I think it's just, you know, it's kind of like, okay, but is it possible? Are we exploring all of the most creative ways of looking at this? Because we are hopefully entering a new era where my work isn't niche, you know? And so do the people that are representing me believe that my work is niche and they're only gonna market it to me in this way because that's the way that it's always been, you know?
Totally. I think that makes sense. So something that's interesting about this conversation is the timing, and we're kind of at the very tail end of the WGA strike that happened. And so I'm curious to hear from both of your perspectives. How has the strike and the ensuing fallout affected the management ecosystem for literary agents and managers? Has it at all? Like, what are you seeing? What are the trends? What should we know in the aftermath?
Yeah, it was interesting. I think during that time, managers had to sort of fill a void of sorts. We are at Writ Large, we're sort of well equipped to do so and have always been pretty proactive. So that felt, I felt sort of good about that. But in the aftermath, I think, there's certainly a lot of people, there's certainly more managers, a lot of agents who have become managers because they were agents to represent people and weren't able to do that for quite some time, and have sort of stepped into that role and so I think that's going to be interesting. I don't know if we've really seen what that's going to look like quite as yet, because it's been a relatively short while. But yeah, I think it's certainly changed things, but I don't know that we know exactly how yet.
Fair enough. Jessica, any thoughts on the strike and fallout? Something that you were following, something that you were involved in?
I mean, I was definitely following it. I am not yet a WGA member.
Got it.
But I do think that there's just such a, it does keep, in that same line of thought of like, how the things keep refreshing themselves. And I do think that the way that we look at agents and managers is important to not, like, I might be a little choppy. Can you see me?
You can see you, you're good.
I'm just such a big advocate and follow anytime there is a shift, because I think it's so important to not get into that tunnel vision of like, this is how the industry works.
That makes sense.
I think that's a really great way to sort of think about it, and I think that's why I sort of gave a non-answer of like, shifts happen in this business all the time. It's a very sort of versatile and flexible business, and so it's just sort of like, it's a business that requires that you sort of stay on your toes, and so it certainly affected things, but not necessarily in a way where I was like, I don't that it's going to be like those sort of shifts just happen constantly.
Sure, totally. So this question from Sharon goes great with a question that I was going to ask. So we'll start with Sharon's. Besides a lab, what other avenues can directors get paired up with managers? What would a writer-director need under their belt to show a manager? And I want to add to this the question that I had, which is querying still a thing? I feel like there was a time where everyone was all about query letters and how to write a query letter. And no one that I know who's gotten representation has done so through a query letter. So I'm curious what your perspective on that is.
There's all sorts of ways. I think I sort of touched on this earlier. Certainly not just labs, certainly not just, it's festivals, it's competitions, it's those sort of more traditional avenues where managers and other representatives are like looking for talent and sort of seeking them out. I always say that the most effective way, and this is probably what the majority of people are, is by referral. Is if you have somebody who's an executive or another writer or director or what have you, who believes in your work and can send that to people in their network, that's the most effective way, just because it's the sort of, and this is, it just goes to the top of my pile, because I'm there, it's coming from somebody trusted, you know. And so if my friend who's an executive whose taste I really love says, Lauren, you're gonna love this, I am sort of inclined to check it out quickly. And then there's this sort of other, there's this other element to it. And I, you know, that's just kind of human nature, I think. There's something very base in that. Querying, yes, it's still a thing. I get query letters often. I get a lot of them, and it would be truly impossible for me to read everything that I got through a query letter. I typically will read the email, and then, you know, so if it's intriguing to me, then I will say, yes, send it along. I'll have them sign a release first, but yeah, that it's certainly still a thing. I don't think it is the most effective way to get representation, but it certainly has happened.
Sure. What appeals to you from the email that convinces you, I think I want to learn a little bit more? Like what are the sort of temp posts of a good
Usually
introduction?
It's the log line. It's usually the log line of whatever they're trying to send me. You know, I'm interested when it's like, you know, if it's something that appeals to me, you know, if it's like, I feel like I think I got one at one point that had like a Dolly Parton reference in it, and I just like really love Dolly Parton. So I was like, okay, you know, it's about that. I'd say my recommendations for query letters is keep them very short. I'd focus on sort of your accomplishments and the thing that you want to send. Don't offer to send me 5 things, like one thing and a bit about you, and be unique in that. Like, you know, not only accomplishments are good, but also like something very specific about you. You know, if it's like where you're from, or, you know, something like that, this is sort of tells me a lot that I need to know about you. Like, you know, everyone has those things where it's like, I don't know, I'm Canadian, and I think that like I bring that up a lot because like I feel like it tells you a lot about me, which is basically that I like don't like confrontation and that I'm very nice. I'm like very polite. Or that I'm just like half American and half British and nothing else. But that, and then my big pet peeve is if you're going to query someone, get their name right. The number of times I am called Laura in an email.
Oh no.
Drives me nuts. And it's such a small thing, but it just like, I'm just kind of like, you didn't put in the thought you should have, right? And it's like, I want to work with people who are being careful.
Yeah, that's fair. So question from Bibi X. Do you, I assume this is for Lauren, do you represent small production companies? As a writer director who formed a small production company and uses a lawyer to send scripts to producers, would a manager help? And I was also curious to hear from Jessica, were you someone who had like an LLC to produce your work prior to having management? And I'm curious what the interaction is there.
I don't personally represent any production companies. I'm not opposed to doing so. I think generally speaking, that is more of an agenting game to represent a company, and it tends to be like sort of bigger companies. In a situation where it's a writer-director who's formed their own production company, I think it would be more likely that I just represent the creator, and then inevitably things would funnel through that company. In this particular question, I don't know if they're producing for others in addition to being a writer-director who just runs things through an LLC. In terms of, and I can sort of partially answer the question that you asked, Jessica, and from my perspective is a lot of my clients do have loan outs once they, you know, get to a certain level for like basically tax reasons that, quite frankly, go beyond me. Again, I'm Canadian. This is all very foreign. But I don't really have to deal with the LLC in any real way. But if they do become producers in their own right, I would certainly help serve that company. I just sort of represent that creator.
Sure, makes sense. And yeah, Jessica, did you have an LLC prior to finding management?
Yeah, I mean, I formed my LLC because we won the Spark 100 Years of Gratitude, and I'd never had that amount of money dropped on me, so I formed an LLC to protect myself at that point. And I mean, honestly, like I think I had bigger preconceived notions about owning a company than I did about having representation, as this kind of idea of what the company could be. And I've come to realize, as I've worked with so many, LLCs for corporations are like popping pills. Like, you open an LLC to produce a project, that LLC is dedicated to that project and protects that company from that project. And I do think at some point it would be lovely to like reconnect my LLC with my brand and be able to use it for producing power and to be able to have producing power on the projects that I'm attached to. But it does feel like with the core, I'm working with Disney and AT&T. I'm not at the point yet where I can say to my tiny production company, co-produce this film. So it does feel like a little bit of a mute point that at this point just helps protect me, from tax liabilities. And if I get sued, I don't lose all my money.
Yeah, I think the power to produce your own work comes at a certain sort of like, I guess the way to phrase it is like level of power or experience in the industry.
Got it. And so, Jessica, I'm just curious because this has come up at other Lunch and Learns. Are you saying that you primarily used your LLC to accept like crowdfunding money? Was there an additional thing that you were hoping for? Have you been using it in between? And would you recommend it to somebody who's looking to crowdfund or beyond? Like, obviously, you're not a legal expert, disclaimer, but I'm curious from your perspective, like, what has been the benefit of the LLC to you beyond like the shielding yourself from the income burden of crowdfunding funds?
Yeah, it has served many purposes. To be honest, it's served purposes in all of my life, in my freelance work, that I freelance edit, so I'm able to work, for them to hire my company rather than me personally, which is very helpful, particularly in California, because a lot of companies have difficulty hiring freelancers now, especially if they're dedicated production companies, legally. So that's all super helpful. It is helpful for any time that there's a windfall of money. I will say that I'm still very protective in what my company will produce and the quality of things that we will produce. And there are things that I'm like, okay, great, my company's called Visceral Productions. It's like, there are things that are like, maybe produce a small film that's on the side and be able to use this to kind of start to build our brand so that when I do get to that point, I can say, look at this small body of work, the quality that we've always created, even if it isn't my personal project. So yeah, it serves multiple purposes, and I honestly, I think it's worth it to have, undoubtedly.
Cool. And just so everyone in the audience knows, we're doing a legal advice and legalese thing, Lunch and Learn, in the next couple of months. So definitely keep an eye on seedandspark.com/events if you want to learn more about that process. So we're about to move on to talking about writing samples briefly, but since I can't believe it hasn't come up yet, and I'm so sorry about this, Jessica, do you mind giving us the logline of Pozole, the project that you crowdfunded on Seed&Spark, and your more recent work, the feature that you were talking about, if you're allowed to share anything about that? I just want to hear from someone who has had a lot of success with your independent work. What was your logline that enticed so many people to fall in love with you before they got to see the really wonderful things that you've made?
Yeah, my logline was very short. It was Maya killed her Nana. It was like very, very like 4 words, and then we had an alternate logline that went, a vegan, like a woman kills her grandmother after telling her she's vegan or something like that. That was slightly more in depth for festivals that wanted something that wasn't quite so pithy. Yeah, but I think, and then the rough log line, I have the toughest feature in the world to pitch in a log line. It's definitely more of a just write it and make people read it. Don't try to pitch it in one sentence kind of film. But it's about a young girl who's growing up in the projects in the 60s in Tucson, and amidst a whole bunch of things that are difficult in her life, tries to unify the race relations in her projects through dance. And yeah, I think one of the things that for me has always been more than the log line is the style of the film. What's your personal voice that's gonna catch people?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And so that dovetails us nicely into this question from Geneva, who asks, what does a lit manager look for in writing samples? Are spec scripts necessary?
Well, there's two different meanings of the word spec, which is hilarious in, of course, film and TV are so much closer together now, but in their divide, like spec in television means a script of an existing television show, and then in features it means just something you wrote for you, essentially. Like on spec is like you wrote a feature for yourself basically, and are trying to sell it as a finished project rather than a pitch or a project based on some sort of IP. So in the feature world, they're great. We love them. That's how you get work. In the TV world, I think they're very relevant for the fellowships at all the major studios, though they still require them. I very rarely read them. And not that I won't, if that's something, if I have read excellent specs and had from my clients, and they, sort of inspired me to work with those people. But I think this sort of goes to the first part of the question, which I'll finally answer, is, what does a lit manager look for in a writing sample is a voice. And I think, and that's what Jess was just referring to, is this sense of style, and voice is such it feels like such an amorphous term, but it's like when I read something, I don't need it to be technically perfect. I need it because I can sort of massage that or teach that or whatever through development. The thing I need is I need to know who you are and what your perspective is and what your voice is by reading a piece of material.
That's awesome. And really quick point of clarification for fellowships, NBC Writers on the Verge and the Warner Media one, which used to be HBO, neither of them, I think the ABC Disney one, none of them actually require spec scripts anymore. So for those of you who are like, do I have to do a spec script TV? The TV definition of spec script. Those three fellowships no longer require it. And it seems like it's probably going on the way out.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if the others follow suit. As I said, they're not super relevant anymore, or not. I don't mean to be dismissive. Sort of just less common, I guess.
Sure. Quick question from a fellow Canadian. Shagan asks, do you have any advice for Canadians trying to break into the industry as a manager or agent? I'm a new graduate from, I assume, University of Toronto.
That is correct, because I went there too.
Oh,
that is where I went for undergrad. I don't necessarily have specific advice because I came here for grad school, and that was very much my entree into the industry. And the reason I was able to sort of get my foot in the door and work here and all that stuff. So my advice would be figure out a way to move to LA, because and which is not the most helpful of advice, unfortunately, because it is not necessarily easy not being a citizen. But I think it's all the same things. It's interning. It's this the advice anyone gives for anyone. It's figuring out a way to get your foot in the door. My advice is not great on this front. I'm so sorry.
No worries. You have a chance to make up for it with Jody's question. So for Lauren, since you're making a career-long investment when you take on a client, how inclined are you to take on an older writer or director?
Equally inclined. I think it's about, again, it's about a voice. It's about an enthusiasm for their work and what they want to do. I don't really care about age.
Great. Awesome. And so question for Jessica, the reason that we wanted to have both like representation on the panel as well as creators who have had representation on the panel is because I think that that's a side of the conversation that pretty often gets left out, which is bizarre since usually the people asking questions are creators who want representation. So I'm curious from your perspective, Jessica, what do you wish more people, more creators, colleagues of yours knew about either getting representation, working with representation, utilizing representation for your like greater career ambitions? What are things you wish people knew?
Yeah, I mean, echoing the point earlier that it is, so much like dating, and it is so hard to kind of in the middle of it remember that the things that are going to kind of steer your career are not things that you can predict. There is very little level of control, and I do think that especially when representation comes up a lot, one of the things that I think we're trying to manufacture is this sense of control. Like, if this happens, then I'll have some degree of success, some degree of da da da. And as somebody that has had so many like really lovely wins that like I can't even process some days, like today is a particular day that I feel overwhelmed and frankly a little emotional about the wins, that it still feels like a little scary. And that once you get reps, it's not going to feel suddenly less scary. And so it's more important to keep breathing, to show up in places that like you think are the smaller festivals, the places that you think that like aren't going to change your life. Show up in those places, because that is a lot of the times where people like Lauren and Bash, like where you might meet somebody that you have a conversation with and you just click, and then you find out who they are and what they want to do for you. And it's such a more genuine experience. And I think the biggest thing is to follow the genuine experience.
Yeah, I want to latch onto that really quickly because it's something that we talk about in our Art of the Pitch workshop, which inevitably people ask, like, how do we meet a manager? And I'm like, that's not the point of this workshop. But something that we really try to emphasize is that it's more important to make a good impression on a person who you think might be a gatekeeper to the rest of your career. It's better to make a good impression and have it treat the person on the other end of the conversation like a person rather than an opportunity for you than it is to get out your elevator pitch as quickly as possible. And I think that that's something that gets lost in a lot of these conversations. We're so laser focused on the logistical, what is the perfect construction of a query letter to get me to the next stage, that we forget that, we're talking to a human being who also has passions and ambitions in this world. Like Lauren's talked a lot about how she went to school for producing and she loves having the intimate, like in-depth development conversations with her clients. And perhaps I think a lot of people would have a better hit rate when they ended up talking to people who they consider like the next step for them, if they don't think about them as next steps, but as human beings who also have a stake in this and are also in the arts for a reason. So that's just something I wanted to call
and
out.
I think that's actually sort of tied to what Jessica was saying earlier about new school and old school as well. I think that idea of like getting out your elevator pitch, even when I was in school, I feel like that was something that was told to me, and I was it just feels very disingenuous, and it's truly I always think of, whenever I hear the word elevator pitch, I think of being trapped in an elevator with someone who's like, I want to tell you about my script. And it's kind of my worst nightmare, because I'm just trying to get out of this building, and I would be so much more inclined to read a script from someone who was like, hey, how's it going? How's your day? than I am somebody who's trying to pitch me this, seemingly brilliant idea.
Hey, let's see if we can jimmy the doors open together. And then maybe once we're out of the elevator, we can chat. Okay, cool.
Terrible situation we're in.
So question from voiceover and mocap guy, very clear-cut log line for this gentleman. Can you share stories of some of the best submissions you got from either writers or directors that blew you away? Something where you knew this person was different and a standout.
I'll be frank that I haven't had that experience with like a query, where I've just been like, again, it's so much about taste. And that's part of what as I sort of mentioned earlier about my job that I love, is I get to choose who I work with and sort of by extension, what I work on. So that's just so deeply subjective that I don't know. I don't think there's something that you can just say or do that's going to separate you in a big way, because it's so about hitting the right person, and quite frankly hitting them at the right moment. Even, there's some days where I'm like, I'm swamped, I don't want to add to my reading list, so I'm less inclined to be like interested in a query, right? Like it's just sort of, again, the human nature of this side of things. But and then in terms of people I've been blown away by, I think this sort of goes back to the question of like, what do I look for in a writing sample? It's like when they have a distinctive voice. One of the things, Jessica, and I like everything Jessica has ever shown me on the creative side. I don't need to see her name on it to know it's hers. And she manages that sort of creative consistency, no matter scale, no matter style, like type of story, even when she's pitched on things that were like open writing assignments or IP, like it's always very distinctly her. And that is what I look for.
That's great. I also think, just to offer my own opinion here, I think it's less important, at least at this phase, if you're still seeking management, to ask managers what they're looking for. And because, since we've already talked about a lot of the ways that managers and other reps find new creators is through the deadline. Hey, these 5 people are in this program. What I would do is reach out to the artists that have been in programs before, reach out to people like Jessica and say, hey, do you mind if I read, do you mind sharing your filmmaker bio with me? Do you mind sharing what the logline was for your recent short film? Because I really, really loved it. And I'm so curious how you talk about it behind the scenes. And I think you'll probably get a lot more useful advice by leaning on your fellow creatives and learning to just figure out what your version of what is working for other people is doing. And also, who knows, maybe you'll make a new friend, maybe you'll collaborate on something because it turns out you have the same taste. You never know what connections are going to get you somewhere. So the worst they can say is, oh, no, thanks, or ignore your email. But, more often than not, especially here in the Seed&Spark community, like filmmakers are very generous with their time and willing to share, documents and bios and log lines and things like that. So when you're curious about that, ask. You never know.
And I think to that point, and you sort of touched on it, is also, if you're asking a manager what they want, you're sort of inherently doing it wrong to begin with, because you should be focused on what you're doing that you want to put out in the world, because then the right person will find you. I don't think, occasionally I'm like, I think I sort of look at the people I represent and I say, oh, you know what? I don't represent a lot of folks who do genre. It's not, I'm not the biggest genre fan myself. Mostly because I'm a wuss, and I get scared easy. But like sometimes I'll go, oh, you know what? I would love to find more in the genre space, because when it's done well, I love what it can do. And so I sometimes think strategically like that, but I'm not gonna just sign someone because they're a genre person. It's gonna be so much more about like their voice and what they offer in a sort of more holistic sense. So I think that you should focus on what you're doing that's specific, and rather than thinking about like who the person on the other end, because they're not going to be the right person long term. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense. And just a quick question from Mark. And I'm definitely also curious about, does having a ton of film experience make it hard or easier for a rep to support a pivot into narrative? I feel like vice versa, it's easy, but that's my question.
Again, it's not, I just don't think in those terms of like, sure, this experience makes sense or doesn't. Like, obviously, is it easier to, like, I just don't think about, it's so much about voice and what you're putting out there. I can't really answer it other than to say that it's kind of irrelevant. Any experience is good. You can construct a narrative to pivot you into narrative. If you are a doc filmmaker who, if that's the move you want to make, I think there's sort of a strategy that can come up on, in collaboration to like figure out how to use that experience to help you. But I don't think it would, I'm not thinking about experience. Like I'll represent someone who's never worked in the industry who writes a script I love. So it doesn't really, it kind of runs the gamut. I don't think there's sort of a hard and fast rule about it.
Yeah, it sounds like, we are taught in traditional school that the way that we get jobs is that we have experience, we have internships, we do the right things, we check off the boxes, and now we are employable. And it sounds like that's not necessarily how it works in the artistic world. Sometimes you could have never written something in your life, written a beautiful script, and that becomes the thing that is your vehicle. And it has nothing to do with whether you've done something. Like we have another question about, is it okay to just do shorts if you want to get into features if you've never done a feature before? And I think we've fairly well covered this, and I'm pretty sure, Jessica, you didn't do any features before seeking representation. So it does very much seem like we're all perhaps thinking about the entertainment industry as like a traditional LinkedIn job, whereas it doesn't sound like that is actually the way that you navigate the world. It's more about your vision, your passion, your craft, and what you want to do next versus what you did before.
Yeah, I love to this is a sidestep from that question, but like when people are like, what are your influences, right? And you're like, my favorite answer is like Dinosaurs, the TV show from the 90s. It always like blows people's minds because it's like we have this idea that we're like we're cause and effect. And we're like 75 million causes that lead us to be who we are, right? And like I think that when we start to get into this mindset where it's like, okay, well, I have to do this. You put yourself into this machine and you take away everything that makes you you. And like that just feels so much harder to actually create. And it just feels like all of these things are like, yeah, well, we're looking for rules. It's so much more interesting to be the person that like Spike Lee doesn't give a fuck, right? Like, like if you want to be a Spike Lee and you're asking like how you like take step by step, like dude didn't go step by step. Like, I just feel like it does feel, because I've had the same feelings. Like, okay, well, when do I make a feature? When do I have this? When do I have this? But I just got to make a Disney movie. I haven't made a feature. So it does feel like, what are those markers of success? And you have to kind of go, okay, well, if I open my mind from that, like, and also like, of course somebody wants to work with me. Like start from there. Like, yeah, somebody's gonna want to work with me that's gonna love what I do because I love what I do, you know? Yeah. I'm here for your pep talks.
Love it. Yeah, I think that's a good sort of note to start to wrap up on that. Like, I think that a lot of the questions from our audience are probably a result of people feeling like, why don't I have representation yet? Is it because of one thing that they haven't done, one strategy they haven't thought of? And usually the answer is no. And you also get this question when you talk about like film festival inclusion, like, why haven't I gotten to a film festival yet? And I can say, as someone who's programmed film festivals, it almost never has to do with your skill as an artist, and it just has to do with what else was on the slate. You know, we can't have two projects that are the same. And I'm sure that, you know, there are similar things. So stop worrying so much about like what's keeping you out and think more about, well, what's going to get you in? And I think that might be something that certainly you have more control over. And based on the conversation that we've had today, it sounds like you're also going to probably find more success that way. So with that, any final words of wisdom, things that you want to leave our audience with, pep talks, TV recommendations, anything under the sun?
I think I'll just sort of reiterate what you said. I think, and it's so funny, like this conversation's been actually kind of illuminating for me in the sense that I've never sort of phrased it so succinctly. So, but that idea that like focusing on you rather than, and is what's going to attract me to you, for lack of a better way of phrasing it. And to go back to what Jessica was saying earlier about like a relationship and the sort of, it is like having a good relationship where you're like, oh, if you're comfortable with yourself and like in a good place as an individual, I'm more inclined towards a relationship with you because it's going to be inevitably healthier. So I think, and the same sort of goes here. In terms of TV recommendations, I'm rewatching Absolutely Fabulous from the 90s, so I have nothing new to talk. I'm
rewatching the original Roswell. Listen, like, you know, sometimes we need to do that.
I mean,
Jessica,
honestly, I'm about to get married in Colombia, so we're just watching a ton of 90 Day Fiance with zero.
Hey, you know what? To each their own.
Relevant.
You know, yeah. I mean, I do. I hope, and the thing that helped me out so much starting as like a Seed&Spark filmmaker, which is self-empowerment, and the idea that, you know, the more specific you can be and the more that you're following the thing that you love, the more likely you are to find an audience. Because if there's something that you love, no matter how much anybody else might trash it, because there will always be somebody that doesn't like what you do. So your goal is to just find the people that love what you do. And I definitely feel like that's, you know, within the Seed&Spark wheelhouse anyway. So
it's absolutely our ethos. Sorry, I'm just wanting to share all the people who love your guys' recommendations. And on Andrea's, thank you for the delicious info note. Thank you both so much for being here today, for lending us your time and your expertise. And I think we have some links for you all in the comments section. Obviously, the social links are now scrolling on by down here. Lauren, I don't think you have any personal ones, just Writ Large Inc.
Yeah,
and,
I don't. It's very personal.
Sure. Yes, do not try to find her. You will not.
It's mostly just like photos of my little sisters and me.
Well, you know what? That is totally fine. And honestly, probably a healthier way to use social media. So thanks everybody so much for being with us today. And we hope you will join us again in the future for all of our upcoming events. We've got free workshops being offered at all times about crowdfunding and pitching and outreach and budgeting and basically anything related to doing the thing that we all hope to be doing. Perhaps it will get you featured on a Lunch and Learn in the future by learning how to take your career into your own hands. So definitely check out seedandspark.com/events, the comment of which I think just got put into the comment section. And we will see you all very soon. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks for giving us a chance to low-key gush about each other.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very fun. Thanks so much.